Welcome to Reinventing Parking, the podcast about parking policy for anyone who wants a better city and better urban transport. Today I'm talking with Todd Litman, author of the extremely useful 2006 book, Parking Management Best Practices. In fact, it was Todd's parking work and writings, along with Donald Shoup's, that got me interested in parking about 10 years ago now. Todd is founder and executive director of the Victoria Transport Policy Institute, based in Victoria, in British Columbia, Canada. In this episode of Reinventing Parking, we cover many of the key essential issues for understanding parking in cities and why and how it needs to be managed. Many of the specifics we mention are from North America, but the key ideas apply all around the world, to cities, rich or poor. Enjoy the interview. Todd Litman, welcome to the Reinventing Parking podcast.
Greetings, Paul. I'm glad to be here.
So the reason I'm interviewing you, Todd, is that you've written so much. You've written a book on the topic. You've written many blog posts on Planetism. Your own website, the VTPI website, has a lot of information about parking, and you're a very experienced parking consultant. And I'd like to pick your brains a little bit about how you attack this issue of parking. You've been talking a lot about a paradigm shift in parking. In other words, a fundamental change in how people are thinking about how parking problems are defined and how the solutions are evaluated. So first up, can you explain a little bit more about the old paradigm in parking as you see it and the main problems with that approach? And then we'll talk about what you see as the new paradigm in a minute.
Sure. So the old paradigm assumed that parking problem refers to a shortage of parking at a particular time and location. That's a very narrow definition of what the problem is. And it assumed that the best solution is always to provide as much parking as possible at every destination, and that parking should be as cheap as possible, preferably free or relatively inexpensive. And so that paradigm, it assumed that it was perfectly acceptable to subsidize parking, that the cost of parking should be borne indirectly through taxes or the cost of developing a building. And that approach may have made sense in areas that are sprawled and automobile dependent, where land is cheap and most travel is by car, and where communities are unconcerned about traffic problems such as traffic congestion and accidents and air pollution. But if a community has high land values, or it's multimodal, so people rely on a combination of modes, or if it's trying to reduce total vehicle travel and encourage more compact infill development, then it becomes important to search for new solutions that result in more efficient management or efficient use of existing parking resources. And so this new paradigm emphasizes sharing and efficient regulations and pricing and encouraging alternative modes of transportation where needed, and a number of other strategies so that you don't have to devote as many resources to subsidizing parking, and that we are treating people who don't drive with equal respect as people who do rely on automobile travel.
So subsidizing something and seeing it as so vitally important that it is worthy of a subsidy. There are things in our societies that governments see as important, and we want to subsidize them for good reasons. But the old paradigm seems to overestimate the social benefit of parking space and underestimate the costs and the negative side effects. It seems to totally misjudge the value of parking. Is it fair to say?
Well, certainly that's part of it, is that parking is a very expensive resource in urban areas. So maybe in rural and suburban areas where land is cheap, it's reasonable to err on the side of oversupply. So if you think you're going to need, let's say, 50 parking spaces, you build 60 so that there's always plenty around. Okay, but as soon as you're in an urban area where many activities occur close together, Land is always valuable, and parking spaces are costly. Most people have never bought a parking space as a separate item. They pay for parking as part of, let's say, buying a house that comes with some parking spaces, or if you're a business, you're paying for parking by buying buildings or leasing office space. And so most people are unfamiliar with the real cost of these things. Paul, what do you think a typical urban parking space costs?
People tend to systematically underestimate. And I mean, even I, who basically know the answer, I'll probably underestimate, let's say 20,000, 30,000.
A good rule of thumb is it costs more than the car that it's going to serve. Generally, a car costs less than a structured parking space. And we give away parking. We don't give away cars, and yet it would be cheaper to give people a car but make them pay for the parking rather than what we currently do. So part of the new paradigm is very simply recognizing that in urban areas, any place where land is valuable and you have to start building structured parking, that parking is very expensive and that subsidizing it is both economically inefficient and unfair. It's inefficient because it encourages people to own more vehicles and to drive more than they would if they paid directly. And it's unfair because it forces people who don't drive to subsidize the parking costs of their neighbors. Now, a lot of this subsidy, it's hidden. It's the result of zoning codes and other development policies that force property owners to pay for parking. It's not necessarily a government subsidy, although there are significant government subsidies to parking, but the majority of parking is parking that people pay for, but they pay for indirectly. They pay for it through their rents or as part of their employment benefits, or they pay for it through taxes. And so these hidden subsidies are very large. They're very distortive of how cities develop. They discourage affordable infill development, they encourage more sprawl development, and they distort our travel patterns. They result in far more driving than what would occur if travelers had to pay directly for their parking spaces.
I think many people assume that these subsidies, these private sector subsidies for parking, are a voluntary matter, that it's a matter of businesses providing parking for their employees or for their clients or for their customers because they see that as good business. To what extent do you think these subsidies are just good business, or are they a matter of policy?
Well, certainly some developers or some businesses would provide some parking. And certainly, especially for wealthy people, if you're buying $1 million condominium, the cost of one or two $50,000 parking spaces seems reasonable. Even if you don't currently own a car, you say, well, I might as well, pay this extra 5% of my $1 million condo for a parking space to go with it. But under many circumstances, developers would provide far fewer parking spaces than what the zoning codes require. And in some cases, the lenders, so banks or other investment organizations, are forcing developers to provide more parking without keeping track of the trends. So what we found when we actually do studies, especially in attractive and economically successful cities like Vancouver and Seattle and San Francisco and New York, we're finding that the portion of households that are car-free is steadily increasing, and the number of vehicles per capita is declining, particularly in the walkable urban neighborhoods. So in many communities in the past, you would have 1 to 2 parking spaces per apartment or townhouse. And now we find that for the higher end, it's down to about 1 vehicle per apartment. And for the lower price, that is for middle and lower income households, or housing that serves middle and lower income households, that it's down to between zero point 0.2 and zero point 0.4 vehicles per housing unit. And particularly if those developments have some of these parking management strategies, for example, that the motorist has to pay directly for the parking. So if the apartment has the parking bundled, if when you rent an apartment, you automatically get a parking space with it, then a lot of people, they will own a car. But if the parking is unbundled, so instead of paying, let's say, $2,000 a month for an apartment with a parking space, you pay $1,800 a month for the apartment and $200 a month for each parking space you want. An awful lot of people will say, no, I guess I don't want to have my own car there that much. I'll rather take the savings. And especially if the apartment buildings have on-site car sharing or car sharing service nearby, we find large reductions in the number of parking spaces that households demand. So we know this is true. There's been some really good studies that have been done looking at these trends. But many of the investor groups, that is the banks and the investment funds, they haven't heard it yet. And so one of the steps in developing the new paradigm is to show the funders, the bankers and the investors, that they can actually get better profit. They can either have lower prices or more attractive units by unbundling the parking, by reducing the total number of parking spaces they're including in the projects, and unbundling the parking and incorporating some of these strategies like car sharing. And in doing that, they're also helping to support communities' strategic goals. So as we encourage the residents of those apartments to own fewer cars and drive less, or in the case of, let's say, an office building, we're encouraging the commuters to use alternative forms of transportation, we're reducing traffic congestion and accident risk and air pollution in that community. And similarly, we're making the infill projects far more feasible. So for example, with conventional parking requirements, a developer might need to provide 100 parking spaces in an office that's designed to accommodate, let's say, 200 workers. And that requires going underground. It requires digging a very deep hole, 2 or 3 levels down, to provide all that parking. And those holes are extremely expensive, and they can spoil the business case for that office building, where if for 200 employees you only had to provide 40 or 50 parking spaces, and so you only have to go down maybe 1 level or 2 levels, that building becomes much more feasible. And so you can have more space in that downtown area. So everybody can benefit, even the people who continue to drive. So even motorists benefit from these parking policy reforms that result in more efficient use of the parking facilities and encourage people to shift modes to more space-efficient modes.
Many of our listeners will be sympathetic to this idea of reducing the requirements for off-street parking and not overdoing the off-street parking. And many of them would have encountered people who then object to say, well, it's all very well assuming there'll be less car ownership and less parking if we have less off-street parking, but in reality, it'll just cause a mess in the streets and maybe spillover parking into neighboring parking lots. How do you deal with that?
One of the strategies that I highly recommend is called contingency-based planning. And that means that rather than expecting planners and engineers to do the impossible, that is, expecting them to predict how many parking spaces that new development could ever need over the course of its lifetime, we say, okay, you can build to the lower end of what you think is necessary, provided that you have a plan which identifies the additional parking management strategies that you would deploy if what you build turns out to be insufficient. So let's say you're building an apartment building and it's got 100 units, but it's located near downtown. And so you think that you only need, let's say, 60 parking spaces for a 100-unit apartment building, but the zoning code requires you to build 100 parking spaces. You say, no, let's build the 60. And here's what we'll do if 60 turns out to be insufficient. And that could include that you make an arrangement with the nearby church to use their parking lots during peak periods, or you might implement on-site car sharing to give residents better travel options, or you might start charging for those parking spaces, unbundle the parking and charge a little bit more. Or you could give the residents a free transit pass. There are many things that you can do, and you can mix and match. You can try a few different combinations of these strategies. As long as they prevent overflow parking problems, everybody's happy. So I recommend that we, as proponents of parking management, we show how contingency-based planning can be applied to address the concerns that people may raise.
On the side of the municipality, the local government, are there things the local government needs to be doing in its part of the bargain with the on-street parking in order for these off-street parking management approaches to be relevant? Like, for example, suppose we unbundle parking in a residential building, and with good intentions, there's contingency planning. But if the on-street parking is free and unmanaged, the expectation would be that many of the residents might say, well, I'm not paying for parking, I'll just park in the street. So what is it that the municipalities have to do to make sure this all works? And how can they, how can we embolden them so that they can have the courage to do this, even if it seems a little risky, perhaps politically?
The traditional solution was simply to force somebody to provide more free parking in order to avoid residents parking on the street, what we call spillover parking problems. So the first step is for the municipal governments to clearly define the parking regulations and the fees and enforce them for any place you don't want that spillover parking problem. If, for example, there's a commercial district where you're afraid people who shop or work there, they'll be parking on the residential streets nearby, the first step is to make sure that there's clear regulation, enforcement of those regulations on those nearby residential streets. That's nothing new. That's done all the time. So it's not a problem in any way to do that. It just might require the municipal government to do a little bit more, to devote a little bit more resources to enforcing the parking regulations, although those will usually pay for themselves through the additional citation revenue. And pretty soon people will learn that they shouldn't park there on that residential street. So it's a problem. It's usually a temporary problem until people become accustomed to the new regulations. The other thing is that cities should do everything they can to efficiently manage the on-street parking. On-street parking is a great resource. It's the most easily shared, most convenient parking. In most locations, there's really no overall parking problem. The conflict is usually over the most convenient parking spaces. So there are a few parking spaces that people are fighting over, are concerned about. And those are often the on-street spaces right in the commercial district or in nearby residential areas. So a municipal government does have to do everything they can to ensure that those prime parking spaces are managed for efficiency and prioritized so that they're really being used by the people who deserve them most. For example, in a commercial area, the on-street parking space should be regulated and priced so that delivery vehicles and people running a quick errand and people with disabilities who are picking up or dropping off passengers, or that those high priority uses can virtually always find an unoccupied parking space because you've got the regulations and the pricings pricing system down. You've done it correctly. And that means that the lower value uses, which is typically the commuters or somebody that's parking all day in an area, that they have the motivation and the information that they need in order to park somewhere that there's fewer conflicts. That's often 2 or 3 blocks away, or it might involve paying to use an Offstreet parking lot. And so when you do it correctly, you've got the regulations and the pricing in place, you prioritize so that the most convenient spaces are regulated and priced to favor the higher value uses. You're making sure that people, especially the motorists, when they arrive there, they have the information they need to find to determine what their parking options are. So for example, if you're in a hurry, you're dropping by a pharmacy or you're picking up your wife at the end of her work, you want to make sure that you've got, let's say, the first 10 or 15 minutes of parking is free, or it's relatively inexpensive to stop off, and that there's always plenty of parking spaces. And if you're commuting to work, you know that if you drive an extra 2 or 3 blocks, that there's a cheap parking space, a cheap all-day parking space, and you'll say, well, that's where I'm going to park. So in order for that to work, you need maps or apps or signs that give people the information they need so that they can find the parking space that meets their needs for each particular trip.
I guess we can summarize the discussion so far in a way is don't make building more parking your first step. Manage what you've already got as the first step. And in all likelihood, you may find you don't need any more. But if you do, then by all means, build a bit more. And one thing you mentioned just now, which struck me, was the commuter who decides to park a little bit further away. That actually is something that people need to think about a lot more and be aware that it's almost like the magic source of parking management, isn't it? That those all-day people, because they take up valuable parking space all day, but we can more easily nudge them because they're parking all day. They're more willing to walk, 5 minutes out of their 8-hour or 9-hour day. Nudging the all-day parkers is a really powerful tool. And so it's not just about getting people to shift to bikes or walking or public transport, is it? It's just simply getting the all-day parkers to park in a slightly more appropriate location achieves an enormous amount. People underestimate the power of parking management because they don't realize that.
Absolutely. So it is difficult to change the paradigm. People are accustomed to particular practices, but the potential savings and benefits are huge. In most situations, in a typical urban area, if we apply just the most cost-effective, reasonable parking management strategies, we can reduce the number of parking spaces needed by 30 to 50%. And if it's integrated with improvements to alternative modes. So if you simultaneously start charging efficient prices for parking and you greatly improve the bus or the train service to that area, you'll often get a 40 to 60% reduction in the number of parking spaces that are needed. That's huge savings, and it leverages reductions in traffic congestion and air pollution and accidents and consumer costs. So there are huge savings and benefits if we could do a better job.
I'm imagining a jurisdiction where politically people are not interested in green transport, sustainable transport, but they do have a parking problem in their denser areas. And so what I hear you saying is that just parking management alone can achieve a certain amount, but it would achieve even more if it's complemented by efforts to have a more multimodal transport system.
Exactly. A comprehensive integrated planning system ensures that every decision, that each individual short-term decision supports your strategic goals. So if you use what you could call a traditional reductionist planning model, so you're addressing each problem individually, a planner or a transportation agency can rationally solve parking problems in ways that exacerbate other problems. You expand your parking supply, even though that's going to stimulate more driving, so it increases traffic problems and it's going to reduce your ability for compact infill development, where comprehensive analysis, or you could say the new planning paradigm, it recognizes that all of these issues are connected. And so the planner and the decision makers are looking for the win-win solutions. That is the solution to a parking problem that also helps achieve your traffic congestion reduction or your affordability or your efficient development goals. And so you're not saying you would never add more parking, but you would only add parking if you're sure that it's best overall, considering all of those goals. Let me give you an interesting example. What type of land use development has the highest parking requirements, the highest parking ratio?
Now, I saw something on Twitter yesterday which totally blew me away. It shocked me. I think it was somewhere in Southern California, requires 22 parking spaces for 1,000 square feet, which is roughly 100 square meters of restaurant, I think it was.
Exactly. Okay, the highest parking requirements are typically imposed on restaurants and bars and pubs and taverns. On one hand, we're telling people don't drink and drive. On the other hand, we're assuming that most people who are going for a sociable evening of drinking are going to get there by driving their cars. What does that do in terms of the location of development? Let's say you wanted to open up one of those really nice microbrewery pubs in your residential neighborhood. What is going to be the constraint on microbrewery pub development in a typical American residential suburb? The parking requirements. So we are not only are we encouraging people to drink and drive, but we're making it almost impossible to create those nice neighborhood pubs that are within convenient walking distance of most people's homes. And yet, when let's say the city council or the parking consultant reviews the parking requirements that are going to be imposed on bars and restaurants and pubs, do they talk about this contradiction? Do they ask, why are we creating parking requirements that contradict our goals for safer traffic and more infill development and increased affordability? Is there a discussion? In most cases, there is none. There simply isn't the awareness, the concern that when you're developing your parking regulations, that you should do everything you can to make them consistent with your other planning goals. One of my definitions of a sustainable transportation system or a sustainable community is a neighborhood where there are convenient restaurants and pubs within walking distance of most houses. And of course, that also reflects not just the walking to the pub or walking to the restaurant, but it also means you can probably walk to local stores and your children can walk to schools. And you've got that compact development. So I think neighborhood pubs are a good indicator and a planning target for overall sustainability.
So this issue of context, in your parking consulting work, if it's anything like my work, the downtown cases are in some ways the easiest. It's really a no-brainer that many of them are already doing pretty intensive parking management. They know what they have to do, more or less. There are others that are not doing it, and it's a no-brainer that they should, and the dividends from doing that would be enormous. But some of the most difficult places, really automobile-dependent places don't even think about this, and they're not even on the radar. But It's the middle and inner city areas which are in some kind of transition that seem to be especially difficult, where people perhaps have been used to having free parking and treating parking as a public good that, will just be there for them. But their neighborhoods are changing. Maybe there's infill development happening. Maybe there's some commercial development nearby so that there's more traffic, more parking pressure. Those seem to be the places that are especially difficult, both in practical terms, because change is always challenging, and in political terms, because change is challenging in a different way. Can you reflect a little bit on the parking policies and how to make them politically feasible in, say, an inner or middle suburb that is undergoing some change, infill development and commercial development?
Right. So that is our challenge. You're absolutely right. There's a tradition. Let's say there's a clear model for downtowns to efficiently manage parking. In fact, many downtowns never fully embraced the conventional or the old paradigm. So in many downtowns, you already have good parking regulations and efficient pricing and flexibility in how many parking spaces are going to be built in new buildings. And you're absolutely right. It's in the transitioning communities where the challenge often occurs. And for those of us who are working as planning consultants, the challenge is to communicate to decision makers, including the local residents who may be concerned about this, that the innovative solutions really can make them better off overall. Now, I'm confident that that's true. I'm confident that efficient parking management can often benefit everybody, that you're benefiting the developers by reducing the cost of development, and you're benefiting the local community by reducing traffic congestion, and you're benefiting people when they drive because you're guaranteeing that they will be able to find a convenient parking space when they're in a hurry. All of these things are good. It's up to us to communicate with those communities the full range of benefits and to find ways to overcome their fears and objections.
One of the strengths in your work, both in transportation and in parking, is that your emphasis on paradigms and mindsets and ways of thinking about these things. Parking is a very practical issue, and for many people, it's below their sort of radar. It only comes to their attention when changes are actually being implemented, and then they might get upset. To what extent do you think we need to work to change mindsets about parking and how people think about parking first, or should we just practically get on with this parking management agenda and hope that as people see that it works well, their mindsets will change? It's a chicken and egg question, but
sure. Well, that's job security for planners, because every situation is unique. There is no rigid cookbook or manual for how you work with a particular community to manage parking more efficiently and overcome their objections. You have to work with people. In other words, it's not a technical challenge so much as a social challenge. It's about working with people, helping people in a community better understand the options that are available, so that the broader range of parking management solutions that are out there, and then communicating the benefits of applying these innovative parking management solutions rather than the traditional solutions. And of course, there are often objections. Some of them are frivolous, but some of them are quite legitimate. So you have to plan in such a way that you overcome the obstacles that may come up. You have to anticipate and overcome them. Often it's things like suggesting that a particular strategy should be implemented on a trial basis, rather than suggesting that it's an inflexible change. And sometimes it's about finding some leader, identifying the people within the community who understand the value of using these resources more efficiently and making the decisions more consistent with long-term goals. Every community has to deal with these problems in its own way, people like you and I can help them identify innovative solutions. But it's really about working with the people in that community and helping them work through the decision-making process that makes it so fun and interesting.
Well, thank you, Todd, very much for your time and for being one of the first guests on the new Reinventing Parking podcast. Thank you very much again.
My pleasure, Paul. Take care.
You've been listening to the Reinventing Parking podcast, and I'm Paul Barter. You can find out more at reinventingparking.org, where you'll find ideas and tips on parking policy. You can also listen to other episodes, subscribe, or leave a comment. That's reinventingparking.org. Bye for now.